Hello, everyone. My name is Mavis, and my partner is Alex, and we are doing our anti-racist project on Black Lives Matter. To start off, we should get into the definition of what is racism. So, racism, in its most general sense, can be defined as social practices which explicitly or implicitly attribute merits or allocate values to members of racially categorized groups solely because of their race. So this definition only covers just the tip of the iceberg of what's really of what racism really means. So we are going to discuss the Black Lives Matter movement, and it'll just kind of encompass just a sliver of what racism is and how it manifests itself in our society even years later. So just a little bit of background information, we should start with Jim Crow laws. So Jim Crow laws had the effect of maintaining forms of discrimination in legal, social, and economic forums. So this was one of the earliest laws or movements, I guess you can say, that started this whole action into racism and movement for inequality. So, in an article from CNN called "Opinion: What Jim Crow Looks Like in 2021," the one of the quotes that stood out in the article was, "But racist discrimination has proved to be a wily thing. When stripped of their law and order, costumed by new legislation and court rulings outlining segregation, those in favor of white rule fashion a new suit and tie to wear. Colorblind racism because the style became the style in conservative circles in the 1970s and not just in the South." So Jim Crow laws is named after an offensive ministerial architecture where a collection of 19th century state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation and relegated Black people to the bottom of the economic order. So, in general, during this time, non white families earned about 54% of the median income of white families in 1950. And while this has changed since then, something still remained the same, where we see that non-white families still earned way less than white families. So Black people had the formal right to vote, but the vast majority, especially in the South, were prevented from voting through various legal maneuvers and threats of violent retaliation. So to point out, our Constitution does allow for basic rights that everyone should be guaranteed. But obviously, as we have seen in Jim Crow laws in its earliest form, this was not the case. So Black people's lack of political power allowed their constitution rights to be ignored. So this violated the codified Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court in 1857, asserting that Black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. So moving on, the next main background historical movement that we should discuss before getting into the discussion of Black Lives Matter is the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement was a political movement and campaign from 1954 to 1968 in the United States, which focused on abolishing institutional racial segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement throughout the United States. So in an article called From Civil Rights to Black Lives Matter by Alden Morris discusses racial segregation and how he has lived through both the civil rights movement and now through the Black Lives Matter movement. So he quotes that racial segregation, which set Black people apart from the rest of humanity and labeled them as inferiors, was the linchpin of this society. So to the right, we see two pictures, black and white pictures. So the first picture was a civil rights movement protest in 1956. And then the bottom picture was a recent photo from Black Lives Matter. So obviously we see that there are a few things changing, but these pictures are similarly, and I think it kind of speaks volumes that even decades later, we are still going through the same thing. So speaking of which, we should discuss two very important cases, which is the Emmett Till case and the Trayvon Martin case. So it's important to point out that there are a list of uncanny similarities between the two cases, and these were 6 decades apart. So first, Emmett Till was a 14-year-old teen that was brutally murdered for allegedly flirting with a white woman. So fun fact, just 2 days ago, the Mississippi grand jury declined to indict the woman, which was Carolyn Bryant, who accused the 14-year-old for whistling at her in 1955. So this case was well known for how brutal and how just wrong it was. And then fast forward 6 decades later, on February 26, 2012, we have the Tree Martin case, which is where the teen was walking home from a trip to the convenience store and he was fatally shot by George Zimmerman, who was a neighborhood watch volunteer. So, just to point out a few of the similarities, both of the people involved in these two cases were both acquitted. So, for example, Zimmerman was charged of second-degree murder, but he was acquitted. So this was when the Black Lives Matter hashtag was first born and first used, and we see now how progressive and how big it's gotten since then. So in general, both youths were Black, both were visiting the communities where they were slain, and in both cases, their killers were acquitted for murder. And in both these cases, the anguish and outrage that Black people experienced on learning of the exoneration sparked immense and significant social movements. Hence, Black Lives Matter today, and then civil rights movement protests back then. So, in this article, Morris argued that the mobilization of money, organization, and leadership were more important than the existence of grievances in launching and sustaining movements, and marginalized peoples depend on the largest of more affluent groups to provide these resources. So we see today that with the Black Lives Matter movement, it went worldwide. People from all over the country, all over outside the country, were for this movement. And I feel like we should also talk about the Brown v. Board of Education case. So this was a landmark case in 1954 that looked at the separate but equal doctrine. So this case kind of threw that out the window and said that it was not okay that this was happening. So it kind of attempted to restate and reinforce a policy against segregation. There's an argument that could be made for this. So today, although there is no physical segregation or separate segregation, we still kind of see that there is a certain line of separation. When we look at poor neighborhoods, we see that it tends to be made up of people of color, low income, and there's not really a large majority of white students or kids in these communities. So I know in like East LA and downtown LA, there are certain schools where they're underfunded, there are not enough teachers for the students, and the materials are either outdated or are not new or not up to date at all. So here we can still kind of see that separation just a little bit. And then the counties are not putting as much effort into these schools, which is not right at all. So in addition, the US economy was built on the exploitation and occupational segregation of people of color. So we see through Jim Crow laws, that segregation, the occupational segregation. And while there are many government policies and institutional practices that help to create this system, the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, are still around, as well as limited funding and the scope of anti-discrimination agencies. And these are just some of the biggest contributors to the inequality in America. So next, we discuss what is Black Lives Matter movements. So the Black Lives Matter movement was first founded in 2013 with the Trayvon Martin case, as mentioned before, and so it was in response to that murder. So Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation is a global organization in the US, the United Kingdom, and Canada, whose mission is to eradicate white supremacy and build local power to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilantes. By combating and countering acts of violence, creating space for Black imagination and innovation, and centering Black joy, we are winning immediate improvements in our lives. So the Black Lives Matter movements, there are a few things that they stand for. One, Black Lives Matter movements, they are expansive. They affirm the lives of Black, queer, and trans folk, disabled folks, undocumented folks, folks with records, women, and all Black lives along the gender spectrum. They also work towards a world where Black lives are no longer systematically targeted for demise. And today, the Black community is pretty diverse. It's composed of Jamaicans, Nigerians, Somalis, Ethiopians, and so much more. And each of these groups are distinguished by their cultures and unique traditions. However, despite this heterogeneity, there are still racist attitudes continue to be manifested based on the color of somebody's skin. So the overall question here is, what does this say about our communities that um, we are still letting something like this color of somebody's skin determine their rights, them as a person. In general, it's just not something that you think it still be around, but obviously it manifests itself time and time again. So when discussing Black Lives Matter and racism, it is important to look at this through an intersectionality perspective. So intersectionality is a theoretical approach that was first developed by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. So intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent system of discrimination or advantage. So when we look at Black Lives Matter, we ask ourselves, how does this intersectionality fit into this discussion? So first, we look at gender, race, and class. So when we look at identity, these are three things that most likely are always together. When you look at somebody, you look at their gender, their race, and then usually when you look at these two things, class just kind of follows. So in general, the United States has a very tainted and bloody history of the way it has and is still treating its Black citizen. So when we look at this, so gender, compared to white men and women, Black men and women are more likely to have a shorter lifespan. So this is due to a lack of good health care, insurance, and there's so much more to it. In general, Black women make 63 cents less compared to a white woman. So today, though the two might still be doing the same work because of the color of their skin, there is still that gap for as far as pay goes. And there are still stereotypes in gender. Today, there are movements with the LGBTQ plus community, and within communities, there's still this stereotype or these certain ways that people are still undermining somebody for the way they choose to see themselves. So when we look at race, overall, Black people still face discrimination because of the color of their skin. They receive more backlash from police, and there's a constant worry they will be profiled because of the color of their skin. We have seen this time and time again, and it's not something that's going to end. It's still going to continue, despite efforts and the way we try to put a stop to it. And then there's class. Overall, it is no secret that there are huge economic disparities between races. So in an article for Black History Month, What is Intersectionality? The author discusses three inequalities, which is structural inequality, political inequality, and representation inequality. So it is important to point out that there are multiple levels of oppression. So the basics start with race, class, and gender, and then we get into these inequalities. So first, structural inequality discusses and looks at how structural policy and practices fail people of color. The most popular examples include racism and sexism, and this does not even include marginalized identities that we have not even gotten into. So most of this stuff are just surface level stuff, just the tip of the iceberg. It goes far deeper than that, and there's so much more to unpack. As we've mentioned before, white women surpass employment rates of people of color. It's political intersectionality inequality. So this defines how people of color exist with two subordinate identities that involve conflicting political agendas. So later on, Alex will go into kind of the political agendas and how it fits into the Black Lives Matter movements. And then lastly, we look at representation inequality. So this provides a way to understand how beliefs about people of color are built and maintained by how their intersectional identities are. So as we mentioned before, gender, race, and class all contributes to somebody's identity. And these are all things that just kind of mix together. So now we look at how does racial disparities and inequalities affect Black lives. So the three basic factors we consider are political, social, and economic factors. So first thing first, for political and social factors, we look at police brutality. As we have seen over the years, police brutality has grown, it has increased tremendously. um, from the I believe the two most serious prevalent police misconducts that we see are excessive force and racial profiling. So we see how police officers use weapons when they're not necessary, and then racial profiling. We see how somebody's pulled over with no really real reason except the fact that the color of their skin. So there is a quote from Professor Daniel Nagin, which is the movement I think is a reflection of and the reaction to that legacy. I don't think people should be surprised by it, and it's part of why people should listen to the Black Lives Matter position. So going off of that, I think we are very desensitized to everything that is going around us. Yes, it's very much still bad, but it's happened time and time again that it's kind of like, oh, there it is again. So moving on to economic factors, the biggest thing is wealth gap. So African American families have a fraction of the wealth of white families, leaving them more economically insecure with far fewer opportunities for economic mobility. So the figure off to the right is breaks down people of color remain overrepresented in some of the lowest paying agriculture and domestic and service vocations. So these statistics were retrieved from the Center of American Progress, and we see that 12.3% of which is Black or African Americans of all occupations, or some of the lowest represent some of the lowest paying agriculture, domestic, and service vocation. It kind of breaks it down by occupation just below that for more detail. So now Alex will discuss the examples that launched in worldwide movements.
The death of Breonna Taylor and the murder of George Floyd were just the tip of the iceberg of police brutality and racial injustice. Most of us first heard about Black Lives Matter movement in May of 2020, when massive protests sparked all over the country and many places around the world. In this slide, we have the chance to get familiar with Breonna Taylor's and George Floyd's cases. In May of 2020, a police officer named Derek Chauvin murdered a 46-year-old Black man named George Floyd. The incident was a response to an intended arrest after a store clerk claimed Floyd had attempted to make a transaction with a counterfeit $20 bill. During the interaction between the suspect and the police officer, the white police officer knelt on Floyd's neck for a reported 8 minutes and 46 seconds, while onlookers filmed and pleaded with him to stop. Following Floyd's death, protests against police brutality, especially toward Black people, quickly spread across the United States and all over the world, bringing the Black Lives Matter movement to yet greater prominence. The summer that followed Floyd's murder saw America's streets rippling with demonstration. On March 13, 2020, when at least 7 police officers forced entry into the apartment while executing a no-knock warrant as part of an ostensible investigation into drug dealing operations, Breonna Taylor was shot and killed. 3 Louisville Metro Police Department officers were involved in the shooting. Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, was inside the apartment with her when the plainclothes officers knocked on the door and then forced entry. The officers said that they announced themselves as police before forcing entry, but Walker said he did not hear any announcement. Thought the officers were intruders and fired a warning shot at them. The shot hit one of the officers in the leg, and the officers fired 32 shots in return. Breonna Taylor was hit by 6 bullets and died. In the next slide, we focus on international response to Black Lives Matter movement. In the peak moment of BLM news headlines, the whole world was speaking about racism, inequalities, and police brutality. Protests were seen in countries like South Korea, Brazil, Australia, and many, many more. Politicians pushed to the wall had to take action. An example is the UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who created a commission to study all aspects of the inequalities. Celebrities and well-known football players spoke up about their experiences, and taking a knee during national anthems became a symbol of support for people of color. Moving forward, we can't forget about the gray aspect of this movement. When the positive noise about the Black Lives Matter movement got quieter, some controversy about the BLM organization popped up. Co-founder Patrice Cullors is accused of defrauding the organization's money and buying worth $3 million properties in an upscale Los Angeles neighborhood. Reports also showed that her brother, sister, and mother worked for and were paid by the BLM organization. Following the accusations, she later resigned. Moving on the next slide, Black Lives Matter protests widely impacted law enforcement agencies. Many cities, for example, Portland and San Francisco, moved some funds from police agencies toward community organizations. Also, police officers underwent extensive training to help better understand racial issues. The Defund the Police slogan became extensively used in the demand for change. In conclusion, equality doesn't mean being all equally poor. The opportunities given to people must be the same without division of their skin color, background, religion, sexual orientation. The Black Lives Matter movement brought up the importance of knowledge and awareness. Many of us were colorblind, racist, and ignorant. The change has started, and we are the ones who need to push it forward. Thank you.
Thank you.